The living room went completely quiet the moment I stepped through the door. A teenage girl stood near the couch, my eyes looking back at me from across the room, my smile resting on someone else's face. She held a book pressed against her chest and tilted her head slightly to one side. I had done that exact same thing at her age. I still did it now. "That's my daughter," I said. The words came out harder than I intended, but I didn't take them back. The girl's expression shifted from surprise to confusion. She stepped closer to the woman beside her and grabbed her arm. "Mom, who is she?" Mom. That single word hit me harder than anything I had prepared myself for. My own mother stepped out from the kitchen doorway, composed, careful, wearing the exact expression she had used on me my entire life. "You need to leave before you cause a scene, Betty," she said quietly. "A scene. My name is Betty Morse, and the day I walked back into my parents' house and found my living daughter calling a stranger her mother was the day I decided I was completely done being silent. I was 17 years old when they took her from me. I did not know they were taking her. That was exactly the point. The hospital room was cold, and I was barely conscious after a long and difficult labor. My mother Judith sat beside my bed, holding my hand just a little too tightly. My father Russell stood near the door. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then my mother leaned close and said the words that would destroy the next decade of my life. "She didn't make it, Betty. The baby didn't survive. I asked to see her. They said it was better if I didn't. I asked for a funeral. There was a small closed casket service 3 days later that I attended in a hollowed-out, sedated state. I screamed until my voice gave out. I asked questions that were never honestly answered. They told everyone my grief was making me irrational, that I needed rest. That time would help. I believed them because I was 17, they were my parents, and I had no reason yet to understand what they were truly capable of. 12 years passed. I left home at 19 with one bag and no clear plan. I built a life in pieces, waitressing, then a better job, community college at night, and eventually a small apartment I paid for myself and a position as a billing coordinator at a medical office. I learned how to function. I learned how to keep moving. But grief has its own memory. Some mornings I would wake up and feel the loss of my daughter fresh. The weight of a child I had carried for 9 months and never held awake. Then on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I walked into a bookstore near my office to pick up a birthday gift for a colleague. And I saw her. She was standing in the young adult section, reading the back cover of a book with quiet concentration. The birthmark on the left side of her jaw matched mine exactly. Her eyes, her forehead, the way she stood, all mine. She laughed at something her friend said, and something deep inside me cracked completely open. I should have walked away. Some part of me understood how it might look. A grown woman following a teenage girl through a bookstore, keeping to the far end of each aisle, watching her move from section to section. But I could not make myself leave. I took careful photographs from a distance using my phone, keeping the shutter sound low so it wouldn't carry. Her face. Her profile. The birthmark. I photographed everything and sent each image to myself with the date and time, creating a record that was officially time-stamped. That evening, I spread my own baby photos across the kitchen table beside the images on my phone screen. The bone structure was identical. The birthmark was in the same position. The shape of the eyes matched precisely. This was not grief playing tricks on me. This was not a coincidence built from longing and wishful thinking. This was her. I sat at that table for a long time before I was able to stand up and breathe normally again. Then I opened my laptop and began quietly searching for answers. It took 4 days to track down where she lived. I returned to the bookstore and asked the owner if she recognized the girl. Described her and showed the photo on my phone screen. The owner remembered her. She came in regularly. Her family lived in Maplewood, just outside the city. I drove to Maplewood on a Saturday morning. The address I had pieced together through publicly posted school event photographs, and a neighborhood directory led me down a quiet residential street lined with oak trees and tidy front yards. I sat in my parked car and stared at the house for a long time before I fully understood what I was looking at. The front door. The porch swing. The mailbox near the front walk. The name on that mailbox was one I recognized instantly. The same name I had grown up carrying my entire life. My parents' house. My stomach dropped completely. I pressed both hands flat on the steering wheel and made myself breathe steadily until I could think clearly again. I did not knock that first evening. I parked down the block and watched the house until the lights shifted from room to room. Eventually the warm yellow glow of the dining room windows told me they were having dinner. I walked slowly up the sidewalk and stopped at the edge of the front yard. Through the large window I could see them clearly. Judith was setting a serving dish on the table. Russell was already seated, unfolding his napkin with the same careful movements I had watched him make for 18 years. And across from him, in a chair facing the window, sat the girl from the bookstore. She said something and Judith laughed. A warm, relaxed laugh I had rarely been on the receiving end of growing up. Russell put more food on the girl's plate without being asked. They looked like a complete easy family. My hand shook as I walked back to my car. I drove 2 miles before I had to pull over because I could not see the road clearly through my eyes. I gave myself 1 week before I knocked on that door. I spent those 7 days writing down everything I remembered from the night of the birth. Every conversation, every face, every word Judith had said beside my hospital bed. I wrote the names of nurses and doctors I could recall. I wrote the date of the closed casket service and everything that followed it. Then on a Friday evening I drove to Maplewood, walked up the front path and knocked. Judith opened the door. She saw me and every bit of color left her face instantly. For just one unguarded second, I watched pure shock move through her expression. Then it was gone, replaced by something calculated and completely still. "Betty," she said. Her voice was flat and controlled. "You shouldn't be here." Not hello. Not what are you doing here. Not even surprised at seeing me after all these years. You shouldn't be here. She already knew exactly what she had done. And standing on that porch looking at her face, so did I, with a certainty I had never felt before. They let me inside only because the girl was upstairs and Judith didn't want her hearing raised voices at the front door. Russell stood in the living room with his arms folded, using the wide, settled posture he had always relied on when he wanted to appear immovable. "You've made a mistake," he said. "You need to go home." "I saw her," I said. "I have photographs. I know exactly what I'm looking at." "You've always had a fragile grip on reality when you're under stress," Judith said, keeping her voice deliberately low. "This is exactly what happened after the hospital. You became fixated. You couldn't let go. We worried about you then, and we're worried about you now. Fragile. Fixated. Worried." Every word was chosen to make me feel like the unstable one, like the problem in the room. But I was not 17 anymore. I was not sedated, isolated, or dependent on them for everything. The girl appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down at me. Something in her eyes held there, just a little longer than simple curiosity would explain. A car pulled into the driveway 20 minutes into our conversation. I heard a key in the front lock, and a woman walked through the door carrying grocery bags. She stopped completely when she saw me standing in the living room. The bags lowered slowly to the floor. She was a neat, composed woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes that were currently wide with shock. "Who is this?" she asked, looking at Judith. "No one," Judith said quickly. "She was just leaving." "My name is Betty Morse," I said clearly. "I believe the girl upstairs is my biological daughter." The woman's face changed. Not the way my parents' faces changed with calculation and practice control. Her face changed the way a person's face changes when a truth they have been quietly afraid of finally arrives directly at their door. "We did everything legally," she said. Her voice was careful but slightly breathless. "We went through proper channels. We have all the documentation." "Then why," I asked quietly, "does she look exactly like me?" The room went completely silent. 3 days after the confrontation, I drove to the hospital where I had delivered 14 years ago. I went to the medical records department and requested my complete file, full name, date of birth, and the approximate admission date clearly provided. The administrator typed it in, frowned, typed it again more carefully. "I'm not finding anything under that name and date," she said. "Try different spellings," I suggested. She tried 4 variations. Nothing came up. "Is it possible the records were transferred elsewhere?" she asked. "No," I said. "This was the only hospital I was admitted to." She looked genuinely confused. "I'm sorry. There is simply nothing in the system for that admission period." I asked for formal written confirmation that no records existed under my information. She provided one without argument. I folded it into my bag and walked out. Medical records do not simply vanish on their own. They are filed, retained, and protected by law for decades after creation. Someone had removed mine deliberately and carefully, and I was now certain I knew exactly who. I spent 2 weeks tracking down anyone who had worked at that hospital during the period of Lily's birth. Most names came from old staff newsletters and community announcements stored at the public library. I called 11 people before I reached Vera. Vera had retired 4 years earlier after 30 years on the maternity ward. She lived quietly on the east side of the city, and she agreed to meet me for coffee after I explained only that I was trying to verify a medical experience from years past. She recognized my name the moment I said it. Her cup went still on the table. "I remember that night," she said slowly. "You were sedated, more heavily than standard procedure would require for a healthy, uncomplicated delivery. My parents handled everything after the birth," I said. She nodded carefully. "Your parents spoke with the attending physician privately. They managed all the paperwork before you were fully alert and responsive." She looked at me steadily across the table. I kept my own notes from that shift. I always wondered about that night. I never stopped wondering. Vera's account gave me enough to push forward. With help from an attorney I had recently contacted, I submitted a carefully worded public records request through the county courthouse. Closed adoptions are sealed by law, but certain foundational filings remain partially accessible when fraud is being formally alleged. My attorney knew exactly which documents to request and precisely how to frame the application. When the paperwork arrived, I spread every page across my kitchen table under a bright lamp and read through slowly and completely. Near the bottom of the biological mother's consent form, the document that legally required my signature before any adoption could be finalized, was my name. My full name printed in clean, deliberate letters. The signature beneath it was careful and composed. But it was not mine. The letter formations were wrong. The angle was different. The specific way I had written the capital letter B in my first name since childhood, a habit so consistent my teachers had commented on it, was completely absent from that signature. Someone had signed my name to that document, and it had absolutely not been me. I had approached 3 attorneys before I found Nina Holt. The first 2 listened politely and explained that reopening closed adoption cases was extremely difficult, that the burden of proof was high, and that 14 years was a considerable amount of time. One suggested, gently, that I consider therapy rather than litigation. I thanked him and left without another word. The third attorney took my retainer, and then failed to return a single call for 2 full weeks. Nina Holt was different from the moment I sat across from her desk. She read through my entire folder without speaking: the missing hospital records, Vera's written account, the adoption consent form with the forged signature, and my photograph showing the clear physical similarities between myself and Lily. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked up at me directly. "This is not just unethical," she said. "Forging a biological parent's consent to a closed adoption is a criminal act. Falsifying medical records carries entirely separate charges on its own." She set her pen down firmly. "I want to take this case." I exhaled fully for what felt like the first time in weeks. Nina filed the legal notice on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Judith had called my phone 4 times. I let every call go to voicemail. The first message was controlled and cold, telling me I was making a serious mistake and needed to speak with her immediately. The second was sharper, with a hard edge of warning underneath the words. The third was just breathing before the line cut off without a message. The fourth call was Russell. He had never called me directly since I left home at 19. In 10 years I had received exactly 1 card from him, and signed no return address. "Betty," he said in the voicemail, "you need to think very carefully about what you are doing. There are things you don't fully understand. Call me back." I forwarded all 4 voicemails to Nina immediately. She replied within the hour. "Good. They're scared. Scared people make mistakes." I saved every message with its date and timestamp carefully documented. The pattern of their panic was becoming its own form of evidence. 3 weeks after the legal notice was filed, Peggy called me. I almost didn't answer, but Nina had advised me to keep all communication channels open and document everything carefully. Peggy's voice was tight and strained when she spoke. "Lily has been asking questions," she said. She saw some of the paperwork that arrived at the house. She doesn't have the full picture, but she knows something is very wrong. What kind of questions? I asked carefully. She wants to know if she's adopted. She wants to know why a woman showed up at her grandparents' house who looks exactly like her. Peggy's voice broke slightly. She's 14, Betty. She deserves honesty. I don't know how to give it to her without everything falling apart completely. I understood what Peggy was really asking. She wanted to know if there was a way to protect Lily from the full truth. There wasn't. Not anymore. Tell her the truth, I said quietly. Whatever version you can manage honestly right now. She already knows something is wrong. Silence will hurt her far more than honesty ever will. My parents had spent their entire adult lives building a very specific image in their community. They attended the same church they had belonged to since before I was born. They were active in the neighborhood association. My father had served on the school board twice. My mother led a women's Bible study group that met every Thursday morning without fail. Their reputation was not incidental to their lives. It was central to everything they did. It was the very reason they had taken my baby in the first place. A teenage daughter's pregnancy outside of marriage had been an unacceptable threat to everything they had so carefully constructed over the years. And now, quietly and steadily, that construction was beginning to crack. Nina had advised me not to speak publicly while the case was active. I followed her instruction exactly. But legal notices are matters of public record, and people in close communities talk without any encouragement whatsoever. Within a month, a distant cousin reached out to tell me that questions were being asked at church. That people were looking at Judith and Russell differently over Sunday coffee. Their carefully built world was beginning to feel the full weight of the truth underneath it. Peggy came to my apartment 6 weeks before the trial date. She had not called ahead. She knocked on a Saturday morning and stood on the landing with her coat pulled tight and her eyes clearly red from recent crying. I let her inside and put coffee on. Nina had told me to document any contact with involved parties. I intended to, but I was not going to turn a visibly suffering woman away from my door. We sat at my kitchen table with cups neither of us touched. I need you to know that I didn't know the full story when we received Lily, she said carefully. I was told the biological mother had freely consented and all paperwork had been properly handled through legitimate channels. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. When Lily grew older and started looking distinctly like, when I noticed, I asked your parents directly. Judith told me you had signed the papers yourself, and then struggled emotionally, and tried to reverse everything afterward. She looked at me steadily. I chose to believe her because I needed to believe her. Her voice dropped quietly. That was wrong of me. I understand that now. Nina advised us to pursue a formal DNA test as early as possible in the process. Peggy agreed without any hesitation. I think by that point she already knew the result before a single sample was collected. She had lived alongside Lily for 14 years. She had seen the same things I had seen the moment I walked into that living room. Lily's sample was collected by a court-appointed professional at a neutral medical office. Mine was taken the same morning. The process was quiet and straightforward. A simple swab, a sealed container, a chain of custody form signed carefully by everyone present. The results arrived 12 days later in a plain envelope addressed directly to Nina's office. She called me at 8 in the morning. 99.9%, she said. The lab confirmed a biological mother and daughter relationship without any ambiguity. I sat down on the edge of my bed and held the phone pressed against my chest for a long, quiet moment. After 14 years of being told my child had died, after 14 years of grief, silence, and second-guessing my own memory, there it was. Documented. Scientific. Undeniable. She was mine. The courthouse was busy on the first morning of the hearing. I arrived early with Nina, wearing a plain navy blazer and flat shoes. Nina had coached me carefully in the days before. You are not here to perform grief or anger, she had said. You are here to be credible. Let the evidence speak at full volume and let your composure speak steadily beside it. My parents arrived 20 minutes after we were already seated. They came with their attorney, an older man in a good suit who moved with the quiet ease of someone accustomed to winning cases through procedure and careful delay. Judith wore a gray dress and her church-polished expression. Russell walked with his shoulders squared and his chin deliberately elevated. They looked exactly like the people they had always tried to appear to be. They glanced toward me once as they took their seats. Judith's eyes moved across me and away quickly, like she was deliberately refusing to let them rest on my face. I kept my hands flat on the table and my expression completely steady. Whatever arguments they had prepared to make, the evidence waiting in that courtroom was fully prepared to answer every single one. Vera took the stand on the second day of the hearing. She was 71 years old and walked slowly, but her voice was clear and entirely steady when the clerk asked her to state her name. She had worked on the maternity ward for 30 years. She remembered the night of Lily's birth with precise and specific detail. She described my sedation level, significantly above standard protocol for a healthy, uncomplicated delivery. She stated that my parents had held a private conversation with the attending physician before I regained full consciousness. She confirmed that all post-delivery paperwork had been managed by my parents while I was still sedated, and that she had never personally witnessed me sign any document. When my parents' attorney cross-examined her, he pressed hard on her ability to recall a night 14 years in the past. Vera looked at him calmly. "I kept a personal work log," she said. "Every year I worked that ward." She produced a small bound notebook from beside her. "The entry for that specific night is dated, timed, and detailed." The attorney looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he sat down without asking another question. No one had expected Lily to speak. Nina had told me it was possible but not to count on it. Lily was 14, old enough for a judge to consider her perspective, but young enough that no one would pressure her to take a formal position in a proceeding this painful. But Lily had asked to speak herself. She stood at the front of the courtroom in a simple blue sweater, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not look at my parents. She did not look at Peggy. She looked directly at the judge and spoke clearly and without rushing. "I've known for 2 months that I was adopted," she said. "Nobody explained it properly. I found out through pieces of paper and whispered conversations and people looking at me like I was something fragile that might shatter." She paused, then continued. "What hurts most isn't that I was adopted. It's that the truth was hidden deliberately. From Betty. From me. From everyone who deserved to know." Her voice stayed level and steady. "I feel like 2 lives were stolen at exactly the same time. Hers and mine." The courtroom was absolutely still around her words. My parents' attorney had built their defense around 2 arguments. The first was that the adoption had been carried out through legitimate channels and all proper procedures had been genuinely followed. The second was that their actions had been motivated entirely by concern for my welfare and the child's, given my young age and emotional state at the time. Vera's testimony had already dismantled the first argument completely. The second collapsed on its own weight. "We made the decision we believed was best," Judith said from the stand. Her voice was controlled but noticeably thinner than usual, like something underneath it was beginning to give way at last. Betty was a child herself. She was not capable of raising a baby responsibly. "We protected the family." "You protected the family's reputation," Nina said plainly. Judith's jaw tightened visibly. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Hargrove, you have presented forged consent documents and testified simultaneously that you acted in the child's best interests. These are not compatible positions." Her voice was measured but hard. "You did not protect anyone. You controlled them." Judith had no answer. The silence in that courtroom said everything that remained. The judge delivered her ruling on the 4th day of the hearing. I sat beside Nina with my hands folded in my lap and listened to every word carefully, even though my heart was beating so hard it was difficult to concentrate fully. The ruling was clear, thorough, and complete. The forged consent document was declared legally invalid. The adoption, built entirely on fraudulent paperwork, was ruled procedurally defective from its very beginning. My parents were found liable for fraud, intentional emotional harm, and unlawful interference with the biological parent's fundamental rights. Significant financial damages were awarded. The judge formally recommended that the matter of the falsified hospital records be referred to appropriate authorities for a separate criminal review. My parents sat motionless at their table. Their attorney leaned close and spoke quietly to Russell, who stared straight ahead at nothing. Judith pressed her lips together into a flat, tight line. For the first time in my life, she did not look composed. She looked exposed. Everything they had spent decades carefully protecting, reputation, image, control, had been named publicly for exactly what it was. And it had cost them everything. The legal ruling did not automatically hand me my daughter. Nina had been honest about that from the very beginning. Lily had spent 14 years with Peggy. That relationship was real regardless of how it had started. Forcing her away from the only home she had ever known would not heal anything. It would simply create new damage on top of old wounds. So I did not try to take her. I asked only to know her. Peggy and I reached a quiet, careful agreement outside of court. Lily would remain in the home where she had grown up, with Peggy, while we built something real and honest between us slowly. No pressure. No imposed timeline. No conditions attached to any of it. Lily and I met for the first time alone on a Thursday afternoon at a small cafe near her school. She ordered hot chocolate and sat across from me with her hands wrapped around the mug, watching me with careful, thoughtful eyes that looked exactly like mine. We talked for 2 hours about ordinary things. Books she loved. Places she wanted to travel someday. Questions she had been holding about who I was. It was the best 2 hours I had lived in 14 years. The months that followed were slow and honest and quiet, the way real healing tends to be. My parents sat alone in their Maplewood house with a reputation that had crumbled entirely to its foundation. The church community they had built their lives around grew steadily distant. Russell stopped attending board meetings. Judith's Thursday group disbanded without announcement. Brian, who had always aligned himself with their version of events, called me once and said nothing that mattered before the line went quiet. I did not reach out to any of them. I had nothing left to prove to people who had spent years demonstrating they didn't deserve my effort. Lily and I met every week. Sometimes twice. We walked, talked, and sat together in bookstores, which felt right in a way I couldn't explain but didn't need to. One evening, 6 months after the verdict, she called to ask about something she was reading. She talked easily and unselfconsciously for a long while, the way you only talk to someone you have truly stopped being guarded around. Then just before hanging up, she said it quietly. "Thanks, Mom." She said it lightly, like it was the most natural word in the world. I sat with the phone pressed against my chest long after she was gone. She was mine. She had always been mine. And no one would ever take her from me again.